Um, okay, so that works. All right. So hi. Um, this is Effective Documentation Talk. As I was saying earlier, I really wanted to call this efficient documentation, but I wasn't sure that was quite going to get people in the door. I shouldn't have worried because documentation is a terrible topic and nobody ever wants to talk about it. So let's pretend that you're a new developer. Hi, welcome to the team. You're going to come in and you're going to have a bunch of questions. The code, you're going to look at the code, and the code is going to answer how the system works. The tests, you're going to look at your tests if you have any, and it's going to tell you what that code is supposed to be doing. And then you're going to look at the docs, and they're going to answer why. Why does that code exist? Why does that file exist? Why am I using this specific method to do this specific thing? And why is the most important question that we have to answer about our code. Without why, we can't improve our code, we can't refactor our code, and we can't revitalize our code. If we code without knowing why, we are simply creating technical debt. So, what can you do to write better documentation? First and foremost, to communicate, you require an audience. There are quite a few different kinds of audiences that might be looking at your documentation. First, obviously, you have yourself. These are docs that you write for you, by you. You're an experienced developer, you've been all through this code, you've written most of this code, and so you have to have documentation to remind yourself as to what you were thinking at the time. We've got new developers, the new members of our team. They've got questions, and the docs are going to have to provide answers. Often, the documentation is the first thing that any new developer is going to see in your code. And so these documentation has to be complete, correct, and make a good impression. Anybody who comes into a new code base and you've got docs that are out of date, incorrect, or even incomplete, they're going to get a very low opinion of your code. And they're going to have to double check. They're going to get very frustrated. Indeed, that's one of the biggest frustrations I have with any new project I ever join or start. And then you've got your users. Your code can't help them because they're never going to look at the code. In fact, they're often going to be using the web documentation. They're going to go to MetaCPAN, they're going to go to search.cpan.org because that's where Google tells them to go, and they're just going to read your documentation. And so your documentation has to fulfill the role of user documentation, developer documentation, and power user documentation. So there are some requirements to an effective documentation to kind of get the most out of what time we're able to spend on writing these docs. If you can just achieve these minimum documentation, you'll be doing far better than most projects. First and foremost, every single file needs an abstract. This is a quick description. It's one line, basically the too long didn't read version, and it goes, answers the question, am I in the right file? And it goes right up at the top and is the first thing seen. So basically, first line of your file, or second line, that's fine. It should be the abstract, this is what this file does. The next thing that goes up is the synopsis, and it's our code example. This is what real-world usage looks like. So, for example, if you've got a command line program, your synopsis is going to be invocation of the command line program. If you've got an object class, you're going to show how to instantiate and how to use some methods of this class. If you've got a role, you're going to see how to compose the role. And this also goes right up on top. I should mention right now that these are opinions. I am willing to brook discussion of the opinions at the end, but this is what's worked for me over all these things that I've tried, and I'll go into the things that don't work at the end. Next up, after our synopsis, we have a description. And this is where we get into the overview. This is the long form, as long as we need to understand where this file fits into our project. So this is going to be a couple paragraphs at the very least, and it's what I need to understand this file. So this will actually also have to define our terms. I wrote a project recently about IPMI, which is an integrated power management interface. I couldn't even tell you. But I did document in the documentation, so when I forget that acronym that I don't know, I'll be able to look it up. There's also a bunch of other acronyms, BMC, Baseboard Management Console, and a couple others that I'm going to forget. And that's why I keep them right in the file, right where I need them. And this, obviously, goes on top. And finally, kind of a weird one to put up there is the See Also section. But I really, really like this because it tells me related information. It tells me where to go next, but it also tells me where I should have come from. So if I've got, for example, a role or a base class, all my individual classes will link back to that base class saying, here, this thing extends this base class. You need to know all of this first before you can understand the code that's in this file. And well-linked docs are essential. Those people who are using the web interface to look at your documentation are going to, when they come across a term they don't know, they're going to want to look it up. If you can just have it show up blue and they click on it and go to the place where it defines it, they'll be much better off. When it comes to using your editor and following links, I know Vim, if you use the go file function, that will mostly work. I have to this day not realized how to get back from the go file function, but I imagine there's a way that I'm just not good enough to know. I don't know about any other editors, but find and replace or using search will help. So this also goes on top. I know the prevailing best practices is to put things like this at the bottom, but I'll get into why I don't ever put documentation at the bottom a little later. So all this stuff goes up at the top of the file. If you work in newspaper or the web, you'll know this as above the fold. Basically, this is when I open the file for the first time, my editor is going to put me right up at the top. And at the top, I can then see here's where everything is. If I ever get confused, if I'm ever halfway through the file and I don't remember something, I can get right up to the top of the file. All I got to do is click two buttons, and I can see all the documentation that I need. So this is kind of a basic default of the documentation on the top of every module I've written for the last 2 years. Before that, I was doing very terrible things, and I really got to go back and fix all that. But it's hard, and it's documentation, and I don't like doing it. But apparently writing a talk about documentation and giving it isn't as hard as actually writing documentation itself, so that's why I'm here. So for users, this stuff at the top will answer the basics of why. The synopsis will tell me what the code does. Some comments up there will tell me why. The abstract tells me immediately whether or not I'm in the right place at all. And we get a full description that builds a narrative of why this code exists. For new devs, we get to open the file. We immediately see the docs. This is important because going to search for the docs, like getting to the top of the file and getting to the bottom of the file are really, really easy. But if your docs start halfway through and then go to the end, finding out where that token is, are you using the end token? Are you using the some other data token at the bottom? Do I know? I probably don't know. It's hard to find, and docs hard to find aren't very helpful. So for experienced devs, this gives us always know what to search for. So we always know that our docs are at the top. So if we change something in the module, we can go right up to the top, change the documentation, and move on with our day. We don't have to, again, go searching for them. So that was the module documentation. So every module requires a headpiece that has those 4 sections right up at the top. But also we have methods, attributes, and other things, subroutines, etc., interspaced throughout our code. But same as before, we're going to have a bunch of sections that go above that code. So we've got a name. You may be using head 2. I actually use Pod Weaver for all my code, which makes this a lot simpler. I'll digress a little bit to say that Pod is kind of terrible. It is kind of annoying. It has no structure upon which we put on it, which is why I'm giving this talk. But Pod Weaver can take our bad pod and turn it into something a little easier to work with. And I can answer any questions on that maybe after the talk. So after our name, we have a synopsis again. This again is going to tell us how to use our code. It'll tell us our return value. It'll tell us how to invoke the method and what arguments it takes. This is just going to say how to use it because in our description we're going to explain what those are. This is where things like JavaDoc, JSDoc, and PyDoc will say have like little fields that allows you to say it takes in this type, it exports this type. We unfortunately don't get that. We have to use English, and nobody ever says in the job description of programming that you need to be communicating in English quite a lot. But it turns out that is actually one of the most important skills that we can get. And a C also. So often in a method, you're going to need, well, see this other method to get input for this method, or see this other method for what to do with the output of this method. So every single one of my methods looks approximately like this. I've got a name, my synopsis, my description, and then finally my code. And this goes above the method, so I immediately know where it is. So these are a bunch of things that I've done in the past that have just totally not worked for me. These are a lot of best practices I've seen coming around, and we've tried them in projects, and it turns out that they are not actually that good. Specifically, this one first and foremost. I see a lot of people still, even giving this talk, that like to put their docs at the bottom. The problem here is that first and foremost, they're hidden from users. So going off, and I got to search for where the first start of my documentation is, and that can be hard to do. And since it's hidden from you, it's also never going to be updated. So all these docs are out of sight, safely stored away, and that's good, kind of, when you're trying to edit the code, but when you're trying to remind yourself to update the documentation, having them out of sight is not a good thing. Alphabetizing. One of the projects I used to be on would alphabetize all of their methods for organizational sake, and it turns out that alphabetizing doesn't really form a narrative well. So if I'm reading this file from top to bottom, I'm a new user, I've never seen this file before in my life, it's better to start out with these are the things that I need to know right away, these are the methods I need to call, and then here are some helper methods that I may or may not need to call, and finally here are the private methods that I probably just need to know about if I'm only going to work on the code. So for example, here, read this book in alphabetical order. This is the Starship Titanic book, which was Douglas Adams and Terry Gilliam, if you want to actually read this book for free in alphabetical order. And just in case you actually want to write a book in alphabetical order, here is the code that will do that for you. I, however, do not recommend writing your docs in alphabetical order. One of the biggest things that we do as programmers is try not to repeat ourselves. We don't repeat ourselves. But it turns out that not repeating yourselves in the docs is a terrible thing. Docs are allowed to repeat ourselves. Indeed, English communication, even in this presentation, I've repeated myself quite a bit. It allows us, if we skip something, if we miss something, if we don't quite understand something, to pick it up again later because we've repeated it. Methods can have assumptions. We can link to those assumptions, which is a good solution. We can repeat them, which is kind of a better solution. They're right there. Or we can link and repeat to them. So we can say, here's this assumption. If you need to know more, click on this link. And don't forget private methods. I know quite a few developers and myself who say that private methods don't need to be documented. This is totally obvious from context what this private method is doing. But private methods should follow the exact same rules, except you can use them as comments instead. So you can, give it a name, explain how to use it, explain what it does and why it helps, but don't show it to the end users. The end users don't need to know about it. So, as an overview here, the docs are answering why, and the why is the most important question that anybody needs to know about our code. So make them useful, and remember who's going to be looking at them. Kind of try to get into the mind of the people who are trying to look at them. I know that's actually one of the hardest things for me. I will write pages and pages of documentation, and upon editing them, I'll go back and say, oh, wait, I've written this thing assuming that they know this. I need an entire paragraph above this to explain what this concept is. Make them easy to find so that you can edit them, so that people can find them. And do we have any questions? Yeah?
Just questions about recommendation for methods.
Mm-hmm.
I saw two ways. First is one recommendation about all methods, beginner file, and another recommendation of method just before this method. Which was the preferred?
So when comparing putting all the methods up at the top with the rest of the documentation, or having the methods, the method documentation interspersed, I prefer interspersed. People use their editors differently, first and foremost, but when I use my editor, I search for the /sub and then the name of the sub. And that brings me right to the definition of the code. And then I know that immediately above that is the documentation, and then immediately below that is the definition of this subroutine. And in Perl, we don't have any formatting requirements for our docs, but in Python and in Java and in a lot of other languages, there is actually no question. You must absolutely put your documentation above or inside your method. And so both for programmers coming from those other languages and for me personally, knowing exactly where the method docs is, I prefer to keep the method docs interlaced in between. My coworkers have seen this talk, and they have been converted, though they do continually rib me for making them skip documentation as they use, the arrow keys to go all the way down through their code. So it's a battle that I'm fighting, and hopefully I might win. Sorry. Either one.
How do you feel about the Distilla plugin that moves all the documentation to the bottom when publishing the module and CPM?
So that's Podweaver, and I use that. I love that. As I was saying before, it allows me to do things that Pod was not capable of doing. It allows me to just declare this as a method, and then it'll collect all the methods together, so that even if I have functions and methods interspersed, functions being things that are exported by my module, which, why is an object exporting? We won't get into that. But being able to define them in the code differently from how they're spit out in the web documentation is actually very helpful for me, because it allows me to keep them right there with the method. And then, yes, at the end, they're all put together down at the bottom, and then new sections are added that I don't have to update. So I enjoy Podweaver. I use Distilla, but I know that not everybody does. So I wrote a command line tool that allows you to use Podweaver, which unfortunately I haven't linked to, so I'm going to have to show that. But yes, I definitely recommend, if you can, Podweaver.
My only question was, do you have any suggestions for tools for dealing with Markdown after you write your pod? So it's not related to your talk.
Yes, there is. Yeah, there is actually some tools for doing Markdown in your pod. Ingy, I believe, wrote a tool for this. He also wrote a tool for JSDoc, the @ symbols. Here's a command line program that I'll use, Podweaver. I haven't released this yet. I will plan to. I want to talk to Ricardo to see if we can get it included in Podweaver itself, or if I have to make my own app, which I will. So, but it turns out it's not trivial to do, but with this command line program, it is. I am out of time, so if you have any other questions, you can come to me at any time. I'm pre-action as admitted here. Thank you.